The lessons of the Cultural Revolution. What then, for Badiou, is the historical lesson, of the Cultural Revolution? It is difficult to miss the irony of the fact that Badiou, who adamantly opposes the notion of the act as negative, locates the historical significance of the Maoist Cultural Revolution precisely in signaling, quote, the end of the party state as the central production of revolutionary political activity. More generally, the Cultural Revolution showed that it was no longer possible to assign either the revolutionary mass actions or the organizational phenomena to the strict logic of class representation. That is why it remains a political episode of the highest importance. These lines are from Badiou's The Cultural Revolution, the Last Revolution, a text whose very title points towards an unexpected parallel with Heidegger. The Cultural Revolution holds for Badiou the same structural place as the Nazi Revolution did for Heidegger, that of the most radical political engagement whose failure signals the end of, the traditional mode of, political engagement as such. The conclusion of Badiou's text emphatically reiterates this point. Quote, in the end, the Cultural Revolution, even in its very impasse, bears witness to the impossibility, truly and globally, to free politics from the framework of the party state that imprisons it. It marks an irreplaceable experience of saturation because a violent will to find a new political path, to relaunch the revolution, and to find new forms of the workers' struggle under the formal conditions of socialism, ended up in failure when confronted with the necessary maintenance, for reasons of public order and the refusal of civil war, of the general frame of the party state. The key importance of the last truly great revolutionary explosion of the 20th century is thus negative. It resides in its very failure, which signals the exhaustion of the party statist logic of the revolutionary process. However, what if one should here take a step further and conceive both poles, presentation, direct extra-statist self-organization of the revolutionary masses, and representation, as two interdependent poles, so that, in a truly Hegelian paradox, the end of the party-state form of revolutionary activity, guided by the telos of taking over the state power, is simultaneously also the end of all forms of direct, non-representational, self-organization, workers' councils, and other forms of direct democracy. When, in his more recent Logique des mondes, Badiou makes the same point about the Cultural Revolution, his accent changes almost imperceptibly. Quote, the Cultural Revolution in effect tested, for all of the world's revolutionaries, the limits of Leninism. It taught us that the politics of emancipation can no longer be subject to the paradigm of revolution or remain captive to the party form. Symmetrically, it cannot be inscribed in the parliamentary and electoral apparatus. Everything begins, and this is the somber genius of the Cultural Revolution, when, by saturating the previous hypotheses in the real, the high school Red Guards and students, and then the workers of Shanghai between 1966 and 1968, prescribed for the decades to come the affirmative realization of this beginning. But their fury was still so caught up in that against which they were rising up that they only explored this beginning from the standpoint of pure negation. There is a tension between these two interpretations. According to the Cultural Revolution, the Last Revolution, the failure of the Cultural Revolution bears witness to the impossibility truly and globally to free politics from the framework of the party state that imprisoned it. And the cause of this failure is specified at a rather commonsensical level, the necessary maintenance, for reasons of public order and the refusal of civil war, of the general frame of the party state. In short, the exigencies of the servicing of the goods. Whatever the revolutionary perturbations, life must go on. People have to work, to consume, and so on. And the only agency to do this was the party state. In personal terms, no Mao Zedong without Zhou Enlai, making sure that the state functions somehow during the turbulence of the Cultural Revolution. Contrary to this claim about the impossibility of freeing politics from the framework of the party state, the passage from Logique des Mondes perceives as the lesson of the Cultural Revolution lying in the impossibility of pursuing radical political activity within the framework of the party state. The politics of emancipation could no longer be subject to the paradigm of revolution or remain captive to the party form. So neither can we practice revolutionary politics outside the party-state framework, nor can we do it within this framework. No wonder that when, in Logique des Mondes, Badiou confronts the key question, is the eternal idea of egalitarian revolutionary politics with its four components, equality, terror, voluntarism, trust in the people, rooted in the statist party model, relying on a revolutionary state, which exhausted its potential in the Cultural Revolution, with the consequence that we have to abandon it? Or is it truly eternal and, as such, waiting to be reinvented in our post-revolutionary epoch? He offers an answer which is not convincing. In effect, what constitutes the trans-worldly subjectivity of the figure of the state revolutionary is precisely the fact that it tries to make the separation between state and revolutionary politics prevail, but with the twist that it tries to do so from within state power. Consequently, the figure in question only exists if we presuppose this separation. That is also why it is only philosophically constructible today, after a new thinking of politics has made it thinkable and practicable to situate oneself, in order to think action, from within a politics for which state power is neither an objective nor a norm. Badiou's resolution of this deadlock, neither within nor outside the state form, is thus, at a distance from the state form, outside, but not an outside that is destructive of the state form, rather a gesture of subtracting oneself from the state form without destroying it. The true question here is, how is this externality with regard to the state to be operationalized? Since the Cultural Revolution signals the failure of the attempt to destroy the state from within, to abolish the state, is then the alternative to simply accept the state as a fact, as the apparatus that takes care of servicing the goods, and to operate at a distance towards it, bombarding it with prescriptive proclamations and demands? But does not such a position come close to that of Simon Critchley, who, as we have seen, argues that emancipatory politics is, quote, enacted or even simply acted, practically, locally, situationally, at a distance from the state. It calls the state into question. It calls the established order to account, not in order to do away with the state, desirable though that might well be in some utopian sense, but in order to better it or attenuate its malicious effect. The main ambiguity of this position resides in a strange non sequitur. If the state is here to stay, if it is impossible to abolish the state and capitalism, why act with the distance towards state? Why not act in the state? Why not accept the basic premise of the third way? In other words, is Critchley's and Badiou's position not that of relying on the fact that someone else will assume the task of running the state machinery, enabling us to engage in taking the critical distance towards it? Furthermore, if the space of emancipatory politics is defined by a distance towards the state, are we not abandoning the field of the state all too easily to the enemy? Is it not crucial what form state power takes? Does this position not lead to the reduction of this crucial question to a secondary status? Ultimately, it does not really matter what kind of state we have. So when Badiou claims that the Red Guardists prescribed for the decades to come the affirmative realization of this beginning, of which they themselves, since their fury remained caught up in what they were rising against, explored only the face of pure negation, will this affirmative realization be the one of inventing a new way of dispensing with the state, of abolishing it, or a mere distance towards the state, or, much more radically, a new appropriation of state apparatuses? There is, however, another even more important aspect of the failure of the Cultural Revolution. Badiou reads this failure, and more generally the demise of communism, as signaling the end of the epoch in which, in politics, it was possible to generate truth at the universal level, as a global, revolutionary project. Today, in the aftermath of this historical defeat, a political truth can only be generated as the fidelity to a local event, a local struggle, an intervention into a specific constellation. However, does he not thereby subscribe to his own version of postmodernism, of the notion that today only local acts of resistance are possible? What Badiou, like Laclau and Butler, seems to lack is a meta-theory of history that would provide a clear answer to the alternative that haunts postmodern theorizations of the political. Is the passage from large to small histories, from essentialism to contingency, from global to local politics, and so forth, itself a historical shift, so that prior to it, universal politics was possible? Or is the insight into the local character of political interventions an insight into the very essence of politics, so that the previous belief in the possibility of universal political intervention was an ideological illusion? Along these lines, Badiou recently relegated capitalism to the naturalized background of our historical constellation. Capitalism as worldless is not part of a specific situation. It is the all-encompassing background against which particular situations emerge. This is why it is senseless to pursue anti-capitalist politics. Politics is always an intervention into a particular situation against specific agents. One cannot directly fight the neutral background itself. One does not fight capitalism, one fights the US government, its decisions and measures, and so on. But does not this global background nonetheless let itself be felt, from time to time, as a very palpable and brutal limitation? The recurrent story of the contemporary left is that of a leader or party elected with universal enthusiasm, promising a new world, Mandela, Lula. But then, sooner or later, usually after a couple of years, they stumble upon the key dilemma. Does one dare touch the capitalist mechanisms, or does one decide to play the game? If one disturbs the mechanisms, one is very swiftly punished by market perturbations, economic chaos, and the rest. So although it is true that anti-capitalism cannot be directly the goal of political action, in politics one opposes concrete political agents and their actions, not an anonymous system. One should apply here the Lacanian distinction between goal and aim. If not the immediate goal of the emancipatory politics, anti-capitalism should be its ultimate aim, the horizon of all its activity. Is this not the lesson of Marx's notion of the critique of political economy, totally absent in Badiou? Although the sphere of the economy appears apolitical, it is the secret point of reference and structuring principle of political struggles. A few days before the Czech municipal and Senate elections on October 16, 2006, the Ministry of the Interior of the Czech Republic banned the organization the Communist Youth League, KSM. What was its criminal idea on account of which, according to the Ministry of the Interior, the KSM deserved to be banned? The fact that its program advocates the transformation of private property of the means of production into social property, thereby contradicting the Czech constitution. To claim that the demand for social ownership of the means of production is a crime is to say that modern left-wing thought has criminal roots. The act proper is precisely an intervention which does not merely operate within a given background, but disturbs its coordinates and thus renders it visible as a background. So, in contemporary politics, a sine qua non of an act is that it disturbs the background status of the economy by rendering palpable its political dimension, which is why Marx wrote on political economy. Recall Wendy Brown's trenchant observation that If Marxism had any analytical value for political theory, was it not in the insistence that the problem of freedom was contained in the social relations implicitly declared unpolitical, that is, naturalized, in liberal discourse? This is why the political purchase of contemporary American identity politics would seem to be achieved in part through a certain renaturalization of capitalism. The crucial question to be asked is thus, quote, to what extent a critique of capitalism is foreclosed by the current configuration of oppositional politics, and not simply by the loss of the socialist alternative or the ostensible triumph of liberalism in the global order. In contrast with the Marxist critique of a social whole and the Marxist vision of total transformation, to what extent do identity politics require a standard internal to existing society against which to pitch their claims? A standard that not only preserves capitalism from critique, but sustains the invisibility and inarticulateness of class, not incidentally, but endemically. Could we have stumbled upon one reason why class is invariably named but rarely theorized or developed in the multiculturalist mantra: race, class, gender, sexuality? Although Badiou's universalism is, of course, radically opposed to identity politics, does it not share with it this renaturalization of capitalism in the guise of the reduction of capitalism to an omnipresent background of political struggles? Furthermore, the irony here is that this renaturalization of capitalism into a presupposed background is the key ideological constituent of what Fukuyama called the end of history. The obvious choice apropos Fukuyama seems to be either one accepts his pseudo-Hegelian thesis on the end of history, on the finally found rational form of social life, or one emphasizes that struggles and historical contingency go on, that we are far from any end of history. My point is that neither of the two options is truly Hegelian. One should, of course, reject the naive notion of the end of history in the sense of achieved reconciliation, of the battle in principle already won. However, with today's global capitalist liberal democratic order, with this regime of global reflexivity, we did reach a qualitative break with all history hitherto. History did, in a way, reach its end. We do, in fact, live in post-historical society. Globalized historicism and contingency are definitive indexes of this end of history. So one can say that we should indeed assert that today, although history is not at an end, the very notion of historicity functions in a different way than before. What this means is that, paradoxically, the renaturalization of capitalism and the experience of our society as a reflexive risk society in which phenomena are experienced as contingent, as the result of a historically contingent construction, are two sides of the same coin. The predominant notion of ideology is that it fixates on or naturalizes what is in fact the contingent result of a historical process. The antidote is thus to see things as dynamic, part of a historical process. Today, however, when the notion of universal historicity and contingency is part of the hegemonic ideology, one should rather turn the critico-ideological perspective upside down and ask, what is it that remains the same in the much celebrated nomadic dynamism of contemporary society? The answer is, of course, capitalism, capitalist relations. And the relationship between the same and what has changed is here properly dialectical. That which remains the same, capitalist relations, is the very constellation which instigates the incessant change, since the deepest feature of capitalism is its dynamic of permanent self-revolutionizing.